So last week, I got quite a lot of stick for my videos on Anthony Joshua versus Charles Martin, and I kind of thought to myself over the weekend, let's have a bit of a rethink next week. Let's try and make some non-controversial videos. Let's stay clear of the really, the topics that are really gonna cause upset amongst the boxing hardcore. And unfortunately, whilst I had the best intentions, I'm going to sit down and record two videos tonight that I imagine will be classed as quite controversial and will doubtlessly lead to people leaving comments suggesting that I'm an idiot, don't know anything about boxing, you know the job. But, if you're going to have a YouTube channel, it's only sustainable and it only keeps you interested if you're able to speak your mind every once in a while. So I'm going to do two separate videos. I suspect both of them are going to be unpopular. The first one, which I'm recording now, is going to be on Felix Sturm versus Fedor Chudinov. Now, before I get into it, let me say, people don't tend to tweet me about Fedor Chudinov. People don't tend to Facebook message me about Felix Sturm. These aren't the boxers on the tips of everyone's tongues at present. So when I was away this weekend, and I didn't do any videos this weekend because I was away, I was quite surprised at the number of messages I got about this fight. And the vast majority of messages carried the overwhelming theme that this was a robbery. This was a disgrace. This was a clear robbery. And I sat down to watch the fight today. Today is Monday. So I sat down to watch the fight probably a day, 2 days after most of you. And I think because of that, there is a chance that my opinion on this fight is slightly warped. Because I got a load of messages telling me this was a disgraceful robbery. And I guess when most people sat down to watch the fight, they sat down with no predetermined expectations. They sat down with no real idea as to how the fight was going to play out. Whereas I sat down with a very strong impression. And I think that strong impression that people had given me via messages and Facebooks, etc., maybe is why I didn't see 100% eye to eye with a lot of the online commentators of this fight. Because I sat down today and I thought, I'll watch the fight before I do a video on it. And I thought, I'll look it up and Chudinov is going to win pretty much every round. It's not going to be the most competitive fight. It's going to be a clear victory and the scoring is going to be obviously disgraceful. But that's not actually what I saw when I watched the fight. From my perspective, I watched a competitive fight where both guys had their moments, and there were certain things in the fight that I thought Chudinov did better, and there were certain things that Sturm did better. In terms of how I scored the fight, I did side with Chudinov. I sided with Chudinov probably, and I've only watched the fight once, and it was a tight competitive fight. I probably sided with Chudinov 7 rounds to 5. However, I can see an argument for scoring closer than that. I could see an argument for a draw, and I believe had I been watching it live, I wouldn't have necessarily gone to the scorecards confident that Chudinov was going to win. And I'm going to talk about why in a minute. But before I get into it, I'll tell you why I went for Chudinov. For me, largely a volume thing. Chudinov, the more energetic fighter, higher output, possibly the harder puncher. At times, you could say he looked like the more hurtful puncher. Some good body work from Chudinov. He dropped levels quite nicely, and you saw him landing to the body several times. And I just feel, on grounds of volume alone, Chudinov did deserve to win this fight. But it was very close. Very close. And for me, it depends what you prefer. Quality or quantity. We'll come on to that in more detail in just a second. But nailing my colours to the mast, I don't think I'm viewing this fight through the same glasses as everyone else. Because I was expecting this to be a demolition job based on the messages I'd received and what I'd read about it. And I also did score the fight to Chudinov. So before anyone kicks off and goes absolutely mental on me, just remember that. But as this fight developed, I really started to disagree with all the tweets and Facebook messages that I'd received saying that this was a disgraceful robbery, this was a terrible miscarriage of justice in a one-sided fight. I thought a lot of things that Felix Sturm was doing in there were better than Fedor Chudinov. Don't get me wrong, Chudinov had the volume, Chudinov had the output. I don't need someone to comment with the CompuBox numbers because I know full well that Chudinov won in that fight. But boxing isn't purely about quantity, is it? You've got to factor in quality as well. And the question for me is, was Felix Sturm's quality enough to score him the victory over Chudinov's quantity? Now, in my personal opinion, the answer to that is no. As you know, I've picked Chudinov and sided with Chudinov to win. I've scored it to Chudinov even. But I can see why the judges did score this fight to Felix Sturm. And I think that's the best way of phrasing it. You know, I can see why Felix Sturm won this fight. Clearly the crowd were very pro Felix Sturm. The crowd was going absolutely mental every time he threw a punch. He had extremely passionate support, extremely passionate, and that probably exacerbated his effectiveness to the judges. But nevertheless, taking that aside, I do think Chudinov was the more effective boxer. I think he looked, I know Chudinov may have landed marginally more percentage jabs, but I thought Felix Sturm appeared to be the smarter boxer from range. I think Felix Sturm appeared to have the snappier jab, and I think Felix Sturm picked the more eye-catching and snappy punches. Admittedly, they were less regular than Fedor Chudinov, but I do think Felix Sturm put his punches together very nicely, and I thought Felix Sturm at times looked like a classier boxer than Chudinov. Chudinov, relentless, aggressive, but possibly at risk of being accused of being a bull in a china shop, a blunt instrument, however you want to phrase it. Possibly slightly basic, possibly one-dimensional. For me, Felix Sturm was picking much better punches, more eye-catching punches. He was defensively quite slick in there, Sturm. Often, what he would do, you know, Dwyer often talks about people having charisma in the ring. I thought Felix Sturm had defensive charisma. You know, when he was coming forward and Chudinov was throwing punches, what you would see is some excellent slipping of shots from Felix Sturm. Yeah, he'd do like head movement left and right, and that would exacerbate the inaccuracy of Fedor Chudinov. And often, you know, Sturm would be standing up boxing and he'd pull back, you know, and he'd pull back really eye-catchingly, and it would mean that Chudinov would end up missing by a good foot or so. And, you know, obviously the crowd were going wild when that happened. And then when Felix Sturm came forward and started throwing punches, he was really able to land effectively with his power punches at times. I believe even on the CompuBox stats, which were obviously generally in Chudinov's favour, Felix Sturm had a much higher connect percentage of power punches, and it was because he was just able to find the gaps with Fedor Chudinov. You know, I think for me what it came down to is Felix Sturm had the classier work. I thought defensively he was smart, he was making Chudinov miss. Offensively he was landing the more eye-catching shots. But Fedor Chudinov was younger, more relentless, a higher output. And for me, as I say, I did score this fight to Chudinov based on that. But I think the way Chudinov fought this fight, he put himself in a position where when it went to the scorecards, he couldn't be sure of a victory. You know, I was seeing his head getting snapped back. I was seeing Felix Sturm having the more eye-catching jab. I was seeing Felix Sturm landing the higher percentage of power punches. I was seeing a definite hand speed advantage to Felix Sturm. I was seeing a definite footwork advantage to Felix Sturm. I thought Felix Sturm's punch selection was better. And you know, Felix Sturm, he did some clever things in this fight. You know, he was deemed to be the older guy, the boxer. I thought Felix Sturm fought a 12-round fight here. He didn't fade horribly in this fight. You know, he fought with credit in that sense. He also came out aggressive. You know, he wasn't just jabbing from range like, you know, you may expect with Felix Sturm having such a good jab. He was mixing it up a bit more. He was trying to push the pace early on. He was fighting up close in the pocket, getting involved into a scrap. You know, Felix Sturm performed with credit in a number of different areas. And you know, I look at what the German judges favour. I kind of think all the Arthur Abraham fights we've watched. And for me, this fight reminded me kind of a Paul Smith versus Arthur Abraham. You know, the first fight they had. Like Paul Smith, Fedor Chudinov had the higher punching output. But similar to Arthur Abraham, I felt that Felix Sturm was landing the crisper, cleaner shots. And you know, was possibly you could side with Felix Sturm based on the cleaner work. You know, you look at rounds and you think, what does a judge remember from the rounds? Well, Felix Sturm was ending the round so strongly. You know, last 20, 30 seconds of each round, he'd come on so strong. He put flurries of punches together, aggressive combinations with excellent hand speed. You know, real good power punches in there. You'd hear the crowd going mental. And I know it's not about the crowd, but I mean, I can see how the judges came to the scoring they did here. I don't think this was a robbery. Yeah, I'd have scored it slightly to Chudinov, but I do think Felix Sturm made him look slightly basic in there. He made him look inaccurate. He made him look defensively frail. He made him look one-dimensional. What did Chudinov really have in this fight other than output and body punching? You know, for me, Chudinov did deserve to win, but this isn't a disgraceful result. You know, Felix Sturm was mixing it up on the inside. He was landing the better jab. He was landing the more clinical, eye-catching power punches. He was snapping his opponent's head back. He was fighting on the outside and the inside. He was defensively slick. There's a huge hand speed and footwork advantage. And I think the experience of Felix Sturm really stood him in good stead in this fight. The way he was finishing rounds with those eye-catching flurries, you know. Classic Arthur Abraham German technique of, you know, stealing around at the end. You know, the way he was slowing down the pace with, you know, the referee tactics, etc. You know, for me, it was a strong veteran performance from Felix Sturm, and I think Chudinov's got a right to feel hard done by, but this isn't robbery of the century like people are suggesting. That's my thoughts. You know, just briefly on the super middleweight division. Super middleweight used to be a division of killers. You know, Frotz, Ward, Kessler, Dirrell, etc. The division is a lot weaker now. You've got James DeGale, who's the definite number one for me, but despite that, DeGale himself has looked slightly unconvincing against Bute and Dirrell. You've got Arthur Abraham, who's been fighting a lower level of opposition and struggling when he's been doing it. You've got Chudinov and Sturm, who both look beatable. You've got who's the other one? You've got Badou Jack. You know, Badou Jack needs to go right to the top of the list based on his wins over Anthony Dirrell and George Groves. You know, Badou Jack is a real decent fighter. But my point is, this isn't a division with a dominant champion at this point. This isn't a division of killers. And a guy like Callum Smith, I've been critical of Callum Smith on the way up. Haven't been totally convinced about him, but there are some beatable champions out there. You know, how many of those world champions would you genuinely pick to beat Callum Smith at the minute? It's a competitive division, but it isn't the classiest division right now. And yeah, some guy coming up, some guy like Callum Smith, can cause some upset there. Let me know your thoughts. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Click the thumbs up button if you have. Click the thumbs up button even if you haven't. And press the subscribe. Thanks, guys.